It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, our top story. Donald Trump speaks to his Russian counterpart and agrees on negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, saying he and Vladimir Putin will work very closely together.
I think we'll probably end up at some point getting a ceasefire in the not-too-distant future.
Ukraine's President Zelenskyy, called later by Mr. Trump, says, let's get it done. But the message coming from Washington is a stark one. Joining NATO isn't realistic, America's new defense secretary tells Ukraine as he issues a sobering message to the country and European allies. Also tonight, why Buckingham Palace was involved in meetings about Prince Andrew's private funding, Sky News has learned. Our chief correspondent reports from inside Syria's underground torture prison, and here's the chilling reasons why critics were beaten and killed. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages. That's in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight. Hello, good evening. Donald Trump appears to be trying to remake the world order, one conflict or continent at a time. And after his radical interventions over the future of Gaza, today it was Ukraine and his European allies who found themselves in the uncomfortable spotlight. The US president said he and Vladimir Putin had spoken and agreed to begin negotiations to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. He said they would work together very closely and planned to visit each other's countries. The backdrop was an uncompromising visit to Europe by the president's new defence secretary. Pete Hegseth told Ukraine that joining NATO wasn't realistic and told European countries that America could no longer be primarily focused on their security. Tonight we'll hear from him and from Britain's defence secretary as we assess the new emerging geopolitical world. First, from Washington, our US correspondent James Matthews has this report.
On the day when winter chilled the White House, inside there was a thaw. Donald Trump made contact with Vladimir Putin. In a phone call, diplomacy came in from the cold. The US president swore in his new director of national intelligence and briefed on the other business of the day, the call to Moscow.
I'll be dealing with President Putin largely on the phone, and we ultimately expect to meet. In fact, we expect that he'll come here and I'll go there, and we're going to meet also probably in Saudi Arabia. The first time we'll meet in Saudi Arabia, see if we can get something done. But we want to end that war. That war is a disaster. It's a really bloody, horrible war. And I think we'll probably end up at some point getting a ceasefire in the not too distant future.
The Russian leader had sent a gift the night before. Mark Fogel, an American schoolteacher, was released from a Russian prison.
Everybody knows Mark.
Trump called it a show of good faith that could be a part of ending the Russia-Ukraine war. It is a significant repair in US relations with Moscow. Barack Obama was the last American president to visit Russia for a G20 summit in 2013. Biden last met Putin pre-war in 2021.
Great to be with you.
A Trump-Putin meeting would be the first since Helsinki in 2018. The old New Pals Act is turning superpower politics on their axis. How they turn for Ukraine is an open question. Trump's Treasury Secretary was in Kyiv talking mineral deals. With his boss, Ukraine's president talked war and peace.
I'm
grateful to President Trump for his sincere interest in our common opportunities, in how we can bring real peace together. It was a long conversation. We discussed many nuances, diplomatic, military, economic, and President Trump informed me of what Putin had told him. We believe that America's strength is enough to push Russia and Putin to peace together with us, together with all our partners.
Of the Trump-Putin call, the Kremlin said President Trump spoke in favour of the rapid cessation of hostilities and the solution of problems through peaceful means. President Putin, for his part, mentioned the need to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and agreed with Trump that a long-term settlement can be achieved through peaceful negotiations. It is language to raise hopes of a historic breakthrough early in Trump's second term, even if the question is on what terms and on whose. James Matthews, Sky News, in Washington.
One potential point of conflict between America and Russia was eliminated today. The new US Defense Secretary said the US would not provide any troops for a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine, and any NATO forces deployed there would not be protected by NATO's agreement that an attack on one country is an attack on all. Our security and defense editor Deborah Haynes reports now from Brussels.
While his boss spoke to Vladimir Putin, the new defense secretary met some of America's oldest allies. But this relationship is about to come under significant strain over Russia's war in Ukraine and wider European security.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering.
He then ruled out NATO membership for Kyiv and US involvement in any peacekeeping force.
To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine.
A stark message, too, for his NATO allies.
We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese. As the United States prioritizes its attention to these threats, European allies must lead from the front.
Key to that is investing much more in defence, something the US has been demanding for years. Ukraine won't be surprised that Donald Trump doesn't want it to join NATO anytime soon. But the Ukrainian president told me last week it would be a major mistake if there were no US involvement in any future international force that might be sent to his country to secure its borders in the wake of any ceasefire deal. Speaking to Sky News, the British Defence Secretary refused to be pushed on whether the UK should commit more of its GDP to the military. Are you comfortable with the UK only aiming to spend 2.5%?
I'm proud we're a government that was elected to increase defence spending.
To 2.5%?
That we've made a commitment to increase defence spending that we've not seen in Britain for 15 years.
Yeah, but there's a war in Europe.
That is part of the wider effort that I was chairing, where European nations and others recognise that we must increase defence spending, and we will.
With the US preparing to take a back seat in Europe and huge questions over how Russia's war in Ukraine will end, though, there's a growing sense of urgency here. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, NATO.
Well, despite years of notice of the changing political landscape in Washington when it comes to security in Europe, the continent remains hugely reliant on US forces for defence. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, has this assessment of how significant the moves driven by Donald Trump from the White House could be for European allies like the UK.
Just as the Ukraine war approaches its third anniversary, a bombshell move from Donald Trump, calling Vladimir Putin to arrange talks and instructing his defence secretary to give a speech that has major implications not just for Ukraine, but also for the whole of NATO. The NATO alliance has guaranteed European security for almost 80 years, since 1949. And essential to all that has been America's support. Now, for the first time, that is in some doubt. NATO may have expanded, numbering 32 members now, including Sweden and Finland. But the US is still by far its most important member. America has more than 100,000 military personnel deployed in Europe, has air bases, intelligence bases, and naval assets all stationed here. Donald Trump has been pointing out for years that America spends vast amounts more on defence than any other NATO nation. As you can see here, more than all the other NATO nations put together, with the UK now falling behind Germany into third place. But when viewed as a fraction of GDP defence spending, it looks a bit different. Poland is in the lead, then Estonia, and then America, a flatter line. Now, NATO is thinking of raising its guidelines for defence spending from 2% to 3%. Now, that still leaves it well short of what Russia is spending, almost 7% of its GDP, so Putin can fight his war in Ukraine. US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth says Europe must do more to secure itself, and America has other things to focus on, causing concern about America's commitment to the alliance. But it's what he says about Ukraine that's caused the most alarm in the West, even if Russia is probably delighted.
When he says that if there's a peace deal, there won't be any American involvement in keeping the peace in Ukraine, and it must not be anything to do with NATO, I think that's going to have people in Brussels, somewhat alarmed. Fundamentally, I think this kind of a line will go down extremely well in the Kremlin, because what it says is, right up front, before any negotiation, we're ready to go along with the idea that Russia can help itself to part of next door Ukraine's sovereign territory.
So even before any negotiations start, the Trump administration seems to be ceding ground to Vladimir Putin. After 3 years of war, it says Ukraine must give up the dream of getting all its land back to the borders it had in 2014. Since then, Ukraine has lost around 20% of its territory, Crimea and much of the east. And what Hegseth says about a possible peacekeeping deterrent force along the front line here in blue will also delight Vladimir Putin. So the stage is being set. Russia and America are initiating talks about Ukraine. Ukraine was only notified afterwards. The US is giving Vladimir Putin some of what he wants before talks have even begun. Events are moving fast at a pace set by Washington and Moscow, it seems, with allies, including Britain, struggling to keep up.
So the foundations certainly shifted today when it came to the war in Ukraine and European security. So let's talk now to our US correspondent Mark Stone, our Moscow correspondent Ivor Bennett, and our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes. Mark, to you first of all, very clear messaging from Donald Trump and his defence secretary today, and the prospect now, we learn, of meetings between Presidents Trump and Putin, it seems, being planned.
Yes, and we've learnt within the last half hour or so from President Trump speaking in the Oval Office that he believes he will meet President Putin first in Riyadh alongside the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But beyond that, it seems very clear today that there will be meetings, perhaps that President Trump will travel to Moscow to meet President Putin there. What a huge win that would be for Putin. You talk about profound shift. I think what's striking for me is that so much of this has in fact been signposted. You know, Trump has talked so much about not wanting to be dealing with Europe. Europe should look after itself. He has said so many times they should spend more on security. He has said many times that he wants to end the war, to stop the killing, as he said again today in the last few minutes in the Oval Office. But I think what's so striking today is that he appears to be, frankly, so close to Vladimir Putin, conceding points to him, negotiating points to him, even before the negotiations have got going. I think he is saying some of the quiet stuff out loud as well, about Ukraine having to concede land to Russia, about Ukraine not being a member of NATO down the line. But more than that, he's talking about NATO and NATO forces not being able necessarily to have the security blanket of NATO if they were to act as peacekeeping forces in Russia, in Ukraine. So I think, as Dom said, things moving so incredibly quickly, and Donald Trump kind of out on his own, doing his own negotiations and doing them with the Russian president, and not keeping Ukraine alongside that negotiation. So things moving very fast indeed. And in the last few minutes, he didn't, when asked whether he saw Ukraine and Russia as equal partners in this negotiation, he did not say that Ukraine was an equal partner. That is striking.
Well, Ivor, in Moscow, a phone call lasting well over an hour, the first at this highest level since 2022. So what reaction there then? Lots for the Kremlin to cheer today.
Yeah, lots for them to cheer. I think Russia will be very happy indeed with the way things have gone today for a number of reasons. Firstly, this call has broken the pattern of Western unity when talking about Ukraine. Until now, the line has always been you can't talk about Ukraine without Ukraine, but today Donald Trump did just that. 90 minutes he spoke to Vladimir Putin, and the question is Is that going to be the same going forward? Will Ukraine be included in these talks or not? Kyiv will be extremely worried about that tonight. The second reason I think Russia will be happy is because of what Pete Hegseth said today, Donald Trump's defence secretary, that NATO membership for Ukraine is not a realistic outcome of these talks, and nor is a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. Those were always key demands for Moscow in any peace settlement. And it seems they've already got them agreed before these talks have begun. Russia will be delighted with that. Ukraine will be furious. And the third reason I think the Kremlin will be happy is because of this prospect of Donald Trump actually visiting Moscow. That would be a big win, a huge coup for Vladimir Putin, because his so-called special military operation, his war in Ukraine, was not supposed to end in a peace negotiation, remember. It was supposed to be an outright victory over in a matter of weeks. But the idea of having a US president flying into Moscow on a peace mission, well, you can see how that would look, and you can see how the Kremlin would use that imagery and spin it as a victory over the West. What's more, it would mean Vladimir Putin is no longer seen as a pariah.
Well, Deborah, in Brussels then, what has the reaction been both from Europe and Ukraine? Europe being told you're no longer our priority, effectively you're on your own. Ukraine, as Mark said, you won't get all your land back or join NATO.
Well, for Europe, they are looking very weak and vulnerable. You've got European militaries, including the UK's, that no longer have the capacity or the capabilities to be able to fight a war at scale, or, for example, if they're sending a peacekeeping force into Ukraine, to be able to deter Russia from attacking again. Certainly that's the case in the eyes of Volodymyr Zelenskyy. But London, Paris, Berlin, they've only got themselves to blame when it comes to their over-reliance on the far mightier strength of the US military for bankrolling European security. It's been that way since the end of the Cold War, and countless American administrations have been complaining about European complacency. Donald Trump did it the first time he was in the White House. That should have been the wake-up call. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that really should have been the wake-up call. But now, still, European allies, some of them are sleeping, including in the UK, where the Prime Minister is insisting on sticking to this 2.5% GDP target for defence spending, even though that's only half of what Donald Trump is saying allies should be committing to defence. It feels as though this is a huge crunch moment. Either Europe gets serious when it comes to defence, or it's going to find itself on its own and very vulnerable.
Mark, Ivor and Deborah, after what has been a dramatic day in geopolitics and security relations. Thank you. Now, Sky News has learned that Buckingham Palace was aware of Prince Andrew's efforts to make private income from projects with links to his royal duties. Andrew was stripped of royal titles in 2022 and has been plagued by controversies over his links with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein and with a businessman accused of being a Chinese spy. Well, let's bring in our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, who is here. And Rhiannon, Buckingham Palace has been at pains to sort of distance itself from Prince Andrew. This suggests otherwise behind the scenes.
Well, look, since 2019, I think we've all had an interest into exactly how was Prince Andrew going to fund his private life as he stepped away from public duties. Now we know that last summer, so as recently as then, there was a meeting at Buckingham Palace where palace officials talked about the future of his Picture Palace initiative. Now, that was the Dragon's Den-style events that he held to mix entrepreneurs with investors. Now, what we do know about that meeting is it happened at a time when the King was still funding his brother. What they did is they had in the palace a meeting, palace officials and those from a company called Startup Bootcamp who were interested in the Picture Palace network. Now, I understand that the King's advisors didn't negotiate any kind of deal, but what they were looking for, I think, was some kind of reassurance that any connections going forward weren't going to cause any problems for the palace. So I think it gives us that really interesting insight. So while the palace is saying, no, his finances are a private matter, they clearly were concerned about what he was potentially going to do going forward. It comes as we also have been getting a bigger picture about how important he thought Picture Palace was going to be for him as an ongoing financial vehicle. Documents have come out related to, do you remember those relationships with the Chinese spy? those court cases. One document that we've seen, which was dated the 21st of August 2021, says the Duke needed money at the time and saw the relationships with China through pitch as one possible source of funding. There's also another document as late as the 22nd of May 2024, which says the intention is still to resurrect the pitch programme under the new brand and name Innovate Global. Now, if you're still with me, Innovate Global is really important because recently, this week, there's been reports that his daughter, Princess Eugenie, was at an event hosted by Innovate Global in Tokyo, but also with that company, Startup Bootcamp, which, of course, the palace had their meeting with. I think the interest around his finances just rumbles on, especially now we know that he's been severed, those ties when it comes to the king funding his brother.
Rhiannon, thank you. Sir Keir Starmer told the families of the victims of the Nottingham stabbings today that a judge-led inquiry into the killings would begin within weeks. The mothers of Grace and Barnaby told my colleague Sarah Jane Mee it had been a long journey to get to this point.
I say the word torture not lightly, that we have had to endure to get this far. Had we not, as a collective group of devastated families, had we not had the sheer doggedness and the determination and the ability to have these awful voices thrust upon us, listened to, I don't believe for a single moment that we would have been sat there today being told that. We would have been another report on that dusty shelf.
You've described it before as a shame on the government that you as families have had to take this on and get it to this stage. Did you put that point to him? Because many families who have suffered similar tragedies, who are fighting their own fights, trying to get answers, change, accountability, will have echoed that from their own circumstances. And you've had a direct line to the Prime Minister that they won't have. So did you make that clear to him? It was shameful.
Because we've had that voice, we've chosen to use it, and thank God we did.
Well, failures by the state regarding another killer were highlighted in the House of Commons today. The murderer of MP David Amess had been twice referred to the Counter-Terror Prevent programme. His fellow parliamentarians were told, but Ali Harbi Ali's case had been closed too early. The MP's daughter said the announcement did not go far enough.
Because they released the PLR in Southport, they were forced to release mine. However, this is just a paper exercise. Not one person to do with the perpetrator was interviewed. They went through email logs and paperwork and just wrote up this document. That is not an inquiry. It is not an investigation. There's no accountability. And I will not accept the government to use this learning review as a substitute for me to get my full public open inquiry. And I shouldn't even have to be pushing this hard. My father was an elected politician for 40 years.
To Syria now, and the scale of the suffering under Syria's former President Assad was staggering. More than 200,000 civilians estimated killed by his regime's forces, and another 96,000 disappeared. Many of those victims were imprisoned, tortured and killed in Syria's network of prisons. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, visited the former jail. From there, he sent this special report.
The political security prison in Homs was one of the most feared places in Syria. The Assad regime forces tortured and murdered on an industrial scale. It was a documented conspiracy to keep the family in power, and it intensified as anti-regime protests took hold in 2011 and continued for years. Homs was at the centre of the uprising. Last December, as the regime collapsed, the retreating officers did all they could to destroy evidence of their crimes. It's still burning. Hundreds of thousands of documents were burned, but some survived. With the permission of the authorities in Homs, we returned to see what evidence we could find. Some of the alleged crimes were trivial. Even a text criticising Bashar al-Assad could send you to jail to face torture or death.
Here, someone was arrested because there was a message in his phone that says something bad about President Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, it is just an excuse for them to arrest them and to execute them. I think that at that time, 2012, everyone was arrested, disappeared.
This is personal for everyone. Every Syrian wants the truth. We met Tahar Tadmori last year. He wanted information about the fate of his brother, Firaz. Tahar's family apartment overlooks the political prison. For days, the family kept a constant vigil from this balcony. His brother was called to a meeting at the prison in March 2013. He told Tahar he hadn't done anything wrong and would go to the meeting. They never saw him again.
I see the windows of the prison where the people tortured. I heard the people crying, please stop, beat me. When I hear this, I call my mother and father, please, Baba, go inside. Why? Yes, it's better to go inside because I don't want them to hear the voices from this building.
Thousands of demonstrators were rounded up and held here before being moved to other prisons listed in the documents. The files also list the deaths of some in custody here. Deaths recorded next to their alleged confessions.
And these are the investigators, also signed.
We know that people were being, particularly on Fridays, all picked up and ended up here, and presumably they just went through
Exactly, yeah. And they say, they asked him, for example, that according to the report, that you were seen on the shoulders saying something bad against the government and Bashar Assad. So that was his accusation. And as we have seen there, then he died by heart attack here. Yeah.
It's known regime officials falsely recorded the cause of deaths as heart or respiratory failure.
And here, the head of political security signed this paper, Hossam Luqa.
Hossam Luqa was known for his brutal suppression of the protest movement and was promoted because of it, eventually becoming head of general security for the whole country. He remains one of the most wanted men in Syria for alleged war crimes. Also in the charge remains evidence that everyone was being spied upon, Syrians and foreigners alike. It was institutionalized paranoia.
They asked for someone who is American, so collect information about the American. So this is 2015 in Safir Hotel, and the journalist from Koido, Al-Yabaniya, of Japanese. These are the employees in the UN, in the Safir Hotel.
We continue to search for any reference to Tahar Tadmori's brother Firaz. Finally, in a registration book discarded on the floor, a breakthrough.
This is Mohammed Firas bin Nadir Tadmori. He was arrested 3rd of March 2013. So he stayed here for a month. Here, it says the date when he was set free or sent somewhere else. So it said he was sent to the Committee of Investigation on 4th of April 2013.
The number of people detained here, all recorded in these registration books year after year, is staggering. And from the surviving documents like these, perhaps some answers for the families of the missing.
So many security officials said to us, all the prisoners who were taken before 2013, all of them were killed.
If what Tahar was told is correct, then all of these people detained here at this one prison in 2011, 2012 and 2013, who have not been seen again, are dead. And someone needs to answer for that. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Homs.
The Justice Secretary told Sky News today that the rate of former inmates being recalled to prison after release is not sustainable. It follows a warning from the Chief Inspector of Probation in an interview with Sky News that prisoners are being sent back to jail because it is the easiest thing to do when they break the terms of their release. Here's our correspondent, Molly Malone.
Packing up and preparing for prison, Denzel was released last year after serving a sentence for robbery charges. Now he's been recalled to jail, not for committing a further offence, but for not remaining at a set address, a breach of his licence conditions.
I feel like I'm being punished for being homeless. I'm in university right now. I'm going to end up having to redo the year again and starting over again. At the end of the day, they view us as criminals, and that's what we'll forever be.
Sky News filmed with Denzel as he went to police custody after being recalled. He's now back in prison. The government said he was still serving his sentence, and so by law, he needed to be monitored and in suitable accommodation. His situation, though, isn't a one-off. When we filmed inside HMP Elmley in the autumn, most people reference the same problem.
I'm seeing a lot of people that are going and they're coming back.
We release a lot of people and they're homeless, and then they come back within 3 days.
Cut the recalls down, then the prisons will be empty.
The recall population in England and Wales has more than doubled in the last decade, now amounting to 15% of the total number of people behind bars. Most people, almost 3/4, are being recalled for non-compliance, like not turning up for or missing probation appointments. Less than a quarter being recalled for further offending. Today, the Justice Secretary set out plans to reform the probation service, with more of a focus on those that pose a greater risk.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
And supporting lower-level offenders before things escalate, to help reduce reoffending and the rate of recall.
You've talked a lot about reoffending. Most of the people being sent back, recalled to prison at the moment, aren't reoffending. Recalls, as you know, are at record levels. How big of a problem is it?
Ultimately, that rate of recall in terms of prison sustainability isn't sustainable, so something will have to change. But I do hope that the changes we're announcing today, by getting the shift in time and the focus of time for probation officers onto those higher risk offenders, should ultimately lead to fewer recalls, because they get more time to engage with a person, they get more time to put in place the interventions that are needed to stop that individual from spiralling.
For Denzel, those interventions didn't exist. There was no accommodation, so he was recalled. He was in prison for serious crimes, but now feels the system is failing him. Molly Malone, Sky News.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, joined by the Daily Mirror's Associate Editor, Kevin Maguire, and the Telegraph's Deputy Comment Editor, Annabel Denham. Great to see both of you. Among the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front page of the Financial Times about tonight's top story. The headline: Trump says the US and Russia will start talks on the Ukraine war immediately. That and plenty more, of course, when we come back.
weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines then with the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the Telegraph's deputy comment editor, Annabel Denham. Great to see both of you. So, front pages then, let's take a look at the front pages. The Financial Times leading with the news that President Trump says America and Russia are to start talks immediately on ending the war in Ukraine. Same lead for the Mirror, which quotes Mr. Trump as saying President Putin is now ready for peace talks. The Guardian, meanwhile, says those talks are already underway, as does the front of tomorrow's Times. But the Daily Mail asks, will any peace deal they reach betray the interests of Ukraine? The Telegraph carries the Ukraine story, but leads on the case of a Nigerian woman who was reportedly granted asylum in the UK after joining a terrorist organisation. The Eye says that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is planning an early cabinet reshuffle in what the paper says is an effort to jumpstart Labour. Daily Express, meanwhile, carries a call from the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, for the PM to put the UK national interest first instead of what she calls crazy European human rights laws. A game of no halves. The Metro laments the fact that the 2034 Football World Cup in Saudi Arabia will include a total ban on visiting fans drinking alcohol. And finally, the Star pictures the 4-year-old son of Elon Musk in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, picking his nose with the headline, "Grown Up Spotted in the White House." So, Kevin Maguire, Annabel Denham are here. Dramatic set of front pages, focus on defence, security for Europe, and obviously Ukraine. Kevin, let's go to your paper, first of all, the Daily Mirror, and this idea that the peace talks between Putin and Trump, in a sense, excluding Zelenskyy from this initial bit, are already beginning or underway.
No, and who would have thought two authoritarian white nationalists would have so much in common? And I think every mainstream UK newspaper has about a similar position, supporting Ukraine against Putin. But of course, the Mirror front page is quite. It's straightforward. It doesn't really explain the impact. Calls it a breakthrough, but why is it a breakthrough? Is it a breakthrough because Ukraine's been abandoned by Trump, or is about to be? First of all, he rules out NATO, and then secondly, he's going to force Zelenskyy to cede territory that's occupied. That's not really a peace deal. That is a surrender, if that's what he was. That's what he's forcing on it. But it is. It came. The call 90 minutes came from. As a bolt from the blue. And who's the winner? It's not Zelenskyy. It's not Ukraine. They're the losers. Europe's just cut out of it. The winner is Putin, as far as you can see it now. And Trump himself just likes the showmanship. He's going to have his 3 meetings, one in Saudi Arabia, one in Washington, one in Moscow. It reminds me of the time he went to North Korea to see Kim Jong-un. Nothing came of it, but he rather liked it. And he said bits of North Korea look good for real estate. Well, I suppose now Gaza's taken on that role. But no, I would have thought if you're Zelenskyy, and he released a very careful statement not wanting to criticise Trump because they're reliant on the US for supplying arms.
Well, the FT, which I don't think we've included in this section we've chosen, suggested the phone call today, they said it was 90 minutes long, between Putin and Trump, was the first at this highest level since 2022, one presumes, therefore, before the invasion of Ukraine. And since then, Putin has been a pariah. Yep. So Trump brings him back effectively into the international fold on this. And the answer, the Daily Mail says, is will the peace deal betray Ukraine and all those people who have died fighting for their land and their future?
Well, I think first thing I'd say is that this has in many ways been deeply humiliating for Putin. You need to bear in mind that there are around 2,000 Russian casualties every day. At least that's what estimates are saying. This was supposed to be a special military operation. He was to send tanks across the border and within days have seized some Ukrainian territory. It's clearly not unfolded like that. Look at the state of the Russian economy and the Russian military as a consequence of a conflict which has now been raging for almost 3 years. The anniversary at the end of this month. And nonetheless, it does look like Zelenskyy is going to be the big loser here. I think it's easy, because Putin is the enemy, to think that the US and Ukraine are totally aligned in what they want to happen now and how they want this conflict to come to an end. But in fact, Zelenskyy wants it to end on his own terms. Trump wants it to end as quickly as possible. Of course, during the US election campaign, he said he would bring the war to a close within a day. He hasn't quite met that target, but nonetheless, if he is able to engineer negotiations that do bring peace, even if it comes at a cost to Ukraine, then I think it's something, ultimately the West is going to have to accept.
I think the Mail headline is the best, summing it up, because it does have, will peace deal betray Ukraine? That's a question, and it looks like it will, because, of course, Zelenskyy could have probably done the deal himself. If he does, right, let's stop, you can have all that territory, we won't join NATO, then Putin, you're quite right, at some huge cost to his own country in terms of people and economic damage, but talking to Putin is fine. Like Macron did, Olaf Scholz did. That's not the problem. The problem is always, what do you say to him? And if Trump always likes to think he's very transactional, a great negotiator, the art of the deal, so on, well, he's already given away NATO membership for Ukraine, and he's now given away Ukrainian territory, which actually really, in one sense, isn't his to give away, but it can never be retaken without US support, because Ukraine isn't big enough, isn't well armed enough, doesn't have the weapons or the manpower to do it.
But the difficulty, of course, that Trump is facing is that this conflict has cost the American taxpayer around $180 billion. Now, look at what Elon Musk is trying to do with Doge by slashing federal spending by $2 trillion every year. I think there will be a lot of pressure from voters in America on Donald Trump to pull back from the spending and the investment that they've put into supporting Ukraine.
Let's just look at a few more papers while you're mulling that thought, which was coming out of your mouth. Apologies for stopping you. The Times, I'm just going to go to now. Trump and Putin start Ukraine peace talks. Zelenskyy has a meaningful call with the US president. Many of the papers pointing out that Zelenskyy was called after this phone conversation between Putin and Trump. The Telegraph as well, on their front page, Trump and Putin start talks to end the war in Ukraine, as well on the side column there, still picturing the conversations from the day before. But The Guardian does talk about, what Pete Hegseth said in Europe. Kyiv told it must cede territory, going back to 2014, which was Crimea, as we know, and part of the Donbass, and rejecting NATO membership, which, to be fair, Biden had done already. But the other messages that we heard from Pete Hegseth was, Europe is no longer our priority. We are concerned about the South China Sea and China, which effectively means in this 80th anniversary year for the end of the Second World War, it feels like we're back to 1940, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, when Biden was in the White House, it felt, in fact, the US was an ally. Now it doesn't feel like an ally. At times with Trump, it feels like a hostile power. He's a leader of a hostile power who talks more warmly about Putin than he does the leaders of allies and neighbours, whether you're Canada or Mexico or many European countries, although he seems to have a crush on Keir Starmer at the moment. How long that'll last, we'll see. It's amazing how you can prostitute out the royal family to keep him on side and use flattery. And that seems to be doing it to some extent. But no, it's big question time for Europe. And I think the UK, I think we look a little isolated being outside the European Union here. But yeah, Europe can't rely on the US anymore. You can see they spend so much on defence because they look eastwards across to Europe, and they look also westwards towards the Pacific and China. And in the end of the Obama period, they were beginning to pivot more to the Pacific away from Europe. And I think that's just going to take a much sharper turn now.
Well, I mean, but my view is that European nations have been quite lazy and quite complacent and assumed that they will always have the support and backing of America. Yet it's been quite clear that there has been this Indo-Pacific tilt underway in terms of US foreign policy, that they're very concerned about the solidifying of the axis of authoritarianism of China and Russia and North Korea, and they've wanted to identify ways to try and combat that, but sort of putting their focus in the Pacific. And I think it was this time last year that Grant Shapps stood up and said, the peace dividend is over. We need to commit to spending more than 2.5% of GDP on defence. And we've made no progress at all.
Well, the Strategic Defence Review, as we know, is underway. Also, Penny Mordaunt talking today about how NATO members are being given a document that they should spend 3% by, I think it was 2035. So 3% still is not the 5% that Donald Trump was talking about. But let's go to the Daily Star, shall we? Grown up spotted in the White House, big arrow at Lil X, Elon Musk's child. I know you both like this one. But anyway, nose-picking 4-year-old finally adds a semblance of calm to the US government. It's been an extraordinary couple of weeks since the 20th of January, has it not? It
has. And, of course, Trump is making the news everywhere. Well, that is it. It's the weather. It's very unpredictable. It's often hostile. It's rarely pleasant, I would argue. But it's incredible. Can you imagine if Kamala Harris had won, it wouldn't be like this at all. It would be rather boring and dull and predictable. Well, I quite like boring and dull and predictable in life. As a journalist, I appreciate Trump and the stories. But what they say, bad news is good news is no news.
I'm just going to say, possibly my favourite line on the whole of the front page is the son of car salesman, Elon Musk. How disparaging of the world's richest man.
The suggestion was that he tried to pull away so that he wasn't in the shot with Lil X, but who knows if that's true. Anyway, in terms of calm, we'll come back with the prospect of a reshuffle here in the UK government, and also why was a Palestinian family allowed to stay in the UK as part of the Ukrainian refugee scheme, a story that's been rumbling all week. We'll discuss that again. Here we go.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre.
Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent.
A show of military might and menace.
Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day.
It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov.
The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kyiv, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world?
Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order.
The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West.
Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word from Sky News?
Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, who was first on display.
Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts.
we've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who've made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Lots to pack in this evening. Kevin Maguire and Annabelle Denham are both here. So if you don't mind, sort of a little bit quickly, because we've got a lot to get through. Annabelle, the eye. Prospect of a cabinet reshuffle.
Yes, well, in 6 months we've had many milestones and landmark addresses and resets, and it still is not going very well for Keir Starmer. His approval rating has plummeted. Reform is now topping some polls and looks like it could be a real threat to Labour. And now there is a suggestion that there will be Starmer's first reshuffle in an attempt to jumpstart the party, and it's the Education Secretary, Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy and the Attorney General Lord Hermer, who has come under a lot of scrutiny in the last few weeks over previously representing Gerry Adams and his involvement in the Chagos Islands deal, who look to be on the chopping block.
Yeah, is this all May elections focused? Is that what the issue is here?
It might. I don't know if it's going to happen. I mean, these stories keep coming along, and some of them are going to be right, and some of them are going to be wrong. Is the truth about it? I'm not sure you're going to really change your fortunes by shifting a few people around in cabinet table seats. And anyway, he's already lost his transport secretary, and he's anti-corruption. Alleged with the anti-corruption minister and neighbour Tulip Sadiq in Camden, and he's lost his health minister just this week. So, how much is he going to have an imminent reshuffle? I'd be very surprised if this was imminent.
They're reshuffling themselves. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, yeah.
But I'd say the two most sort of controversial, divisive figures in the cabinet are Ed Miliband and Rachel Reeves, neither of whom are on this list. Although Bridget Phillipson has made herself quite unpopular in certain quarters
and popular in others.
Reforms.
Yeah.
Let's go to the Daily Express now, shall we? Which was a story that was in today's newspapers, which is a Palestinian family who managed to stay here as part of the Ukrainian refugee deal.
Have they arrived? Have they actually arrived? Because they applied for it. Have they actually arrived?
Well, they've more than applied because they've had their case heard.
Yeah, but are they actually here? Sorry, because I read it in the Telegraph today. The scheme's closed now, but she had. I think the Express have been, how could I put it, very kind to Kemi Badenoch, because I think right across the political spectrum today, left through the centre to the right, they thought she had a nightmare.
Yeah, because she asked this question, and in the first answers, Keir Starmer agreed with her, and then she asked it again, then asked it again.
Yeah. I mean, even I, very, very pro migration, think if you've got a Ukrainian scheme, it's not intended for people in Palestine. I'd be delighted to see a scheme for Palestinians who have relatives here, but there isn't one. So I think the judge, it was overreach, and she couldn't think on her feet. It was really, it's quite painful to watch.
She needs a plan B in case she gets a positive answer from the Prime Minister.
But I think there was a lot that she could have brought up today. She could have brought up defence spending, or she could have, brought up the economy. Of course, we're going to have some GDP data tomorrow. Effects of the budget still being felt. A lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves, and yet she stuck to this quite, narrow line of questioning.
It's to push back reform.
Whether he was going to appeal this ruling in the immigration tribunal.
It's our anti-reform push, isn't it? And that's but it didn't work today.
Yeah. Let's see if we can squeeze in the Times, which is the King and new towns. If anybody can dig out their stack with that.
Yeah. More than 100 areas have applied to be a dozen new towns, 10,000 each, and We had those extraordinary pictures of Charlie being really chummy with Starmer and Angela Rayner earlier the week in Cornwall. And it says, Labour has cited Georgian townhouses and Edwardian mansion blocks as key inspirations. I mean, talk about tickling his chin and getting him on side. If he's going to fall for that, I mean, I can promise you these new towns are not going to be full of mock Georgian townhouses and Edwardian mansion blocks.
Well, I mean, you know, a lot of people speak very favourably of Poundbury and...
it's horrible.
Well, I've never been there, but, you know, pastiche is popular with some people.
It's dystopian.
That's the sort of thing.
If you go live there, I mean, the list of rules, you're not allowed hanging baskets. I mean, if you want a hanging basket, you can have a hanging basket, but no, he says
But,
no.
I mean, look, the point is, if they're able to build new homes and actually get shovels in the ground, that's absolutely tremendous. We have a chronic housing shortage in this country, which is massively driving up the cost of living, but I'll believe it when I see it.
20 seconds on a no-booze World Cup.
I know, this is the Saudi ambassador. What I really like, he says, rather like our weather, it is a dry country. I like a drink when I go to the football, but if you can't have one, it doesn't really change it that much, in all honesty.
OK, that's all we've got time for. I'm sure you want to come back
Happy to let
next
him have
time.
the final word on football.
But there's a bigger issue.
fine.
Why is it in Saudi Arabia? That's the big issue, the hand-chopping,
Kevin,
head-chopping
Annabelle,
regime.
thank you.
Sorry.